Hello and welcome to another in the series of Cafe Insights. I'm Andrew Vine, CEO of the Insight Bureau, and today it's my pleasure to be in conversation with Stephen King. Stephen is the former chief economist of HSBC, now a senior advisor to the bank, and is a writer and author on economic and geopolitical affairs. So welcome to Singapore. So tell us a little bit about why you're here, what you're doing.
Well, primarily it's because of my new book.
Yep.
I'm seeing a few people discussing the ideas in the book. It's called Grave New World, subtitled The End of Globalization and the Return of History. And it seems to have struck a chord because lots of people are very interested in the idea that somehow something's gone a little bit wrong globally, particularly in certain individual countries, and therefore people want to know what is going wrong.
You've written two previous books,
I have, yes.
Losing Control and When the Money Runs Out.
That's correct.
I mean, neither of those have been very optimistic views of the world, but you seem to either have started writing this book before we even knew about Trump and Brexit. So you seem to have a knack for predicting the horror stories.
Well, that's true. I mean, if you go back to When the Money Runs Out, that was a story about the sort of persistence of weak Western economic growth. And at the time people said, well, you could be right, but there's bound to be a cyclical upswing at some point. That hasn't materialized yet. I think that theme's been okay. But this time around, my thinking about the end of globalization, or at least the end of Western globalization, was loosely based on the idea that history taught us that globalization waxes and wanes, and I thought that maybe we're just at one of those points when things possibly would go into reverse. And in one sense, the Brexit and Trump stories reinforce what was a message I was already assembling back in 2015.
I mean, to many people, the notion that globalization is to be challenged is an alien concept, because so much good has come from globalization.
That's
Millions
absolutely
of people
true.
have been pulled out of poverty. It seems that free trade and open markets and integration makes perfect sense, but there's a pushback.
And the global story has worked incredibly well. The number of people exiting from poverty has been absolutely extraordinary over the last 30 or 40 years. And certainly when you look at the advances that, say, China or India have made over that time, it's been a truly revolutionary story compared with previous economic history. The problem actually exists more in the West, that even as China and India have flourished, Western economic growth has slowed down, income inequality has risen, and people looking for explanations for these sorts of things. And while there are plenty of them out there, one, of course, that somehow sort of touched a popular nerve is this idea that it's the fault of somebody else, that, for example, American growth is weak, or that income inequality has risen. So you have a sort of rise of what is described as populist beliefs in the West, which are associated with the idea you can just happily blame other people for the difficulties that, say, the US or parts of Europe have encountered.
In Western economies, there's a whole number of people who feel disenfranchised. They feel that they've been left behind. This notion of inequality, is it a function of wrong-headed economics that has led us here?
Well, I think part of the problem was that economists often looked in aggregate at the results of globalization, focused on the fact that the cake itself would get bigger and bigger. What I think they lost sight of was the possibility that the slices of the cake would be divided in very different ways. And I think there is certainly some evidence that in the West, particularly as a consequence of capital mobility, where companies that could have invested in the West have instead invested elsewhere where labour costs are cheaper, some people in the West have clearly lost out from that story. So the narrative of the forgotten men and women of America, which of course Donald Trump used in his presidential election campaign, that's actually a pretty important narrative, and many people have believed it.
Yeah. And we're in a month where we see the beginning of the negotiations for Brexit. We just had an election in the UK which hasn't given the Prime Minister the kind of mandate that she was looking for. It's kind of an interesting time to be looking at Britain and its situation with the world as well.
Well, it's certainly interesting, although I'm not quite sure it's easy to answer what's going to happen.
No.
Yes, we have a Prime Minister who clearly ended up with a result very different from the one that she had expected. There's all sorts of whisperings in the Conservative Party about whether she would need to be replaced at some point. But you have an opposition which, oddly enough, is also in favour of Brexit. I mean, many people voted for Labour because they thought it was a vote for Remain, but I think Jeremy Corbyn favours Brexit too for slightly different reasons. And we have a situation whereby I think Britain is struggling to work out precisely what it wants from Brexit. Moreover, I think Britain thinks that Brexit's a kind of a la carte menu. You can choose whatever you want in terms of your departure from the European Union. And in fact, what the European Union offers is a series of set menus where you can't choose from set menu A and set menu B at the same time.
And what is the view from where you sit, where you see financial institutions and businesses generally, what do they make of Britain's future? It used to be tied so closely to Europe, yet we're being told to think that maybe this is a chance for Great Britain to become global Britain.
Well, I think a lot of companies are scratching their heads in bewilderment, not really quite sure what's happening and not sure about how they're going to engage with Europe in the future. Obviously, there are parts in the government who would like to think about global Britain in the hope that somehow, freed from the EU, Britain will be free to negotiate trade deals with other countries without having Brussels breathing down their neck. But, of course, if you want to have access to the single market on an extremely positive way, it is very difficult under those circumstances simultaneously to do your own individual trade deals with countries elsewhere in the world. So you come back to this uncertainty, a fundamental uncertainty about what is Britain's relationship with the EU, because that actually then defines what our relationship will be with the rest of the world. So the two go hand in hand, they can't be treated separately in my view.
And back to America, where we've just seen Donald Trump actively pull away from TPP, which Hillary Clinton may have done as well. We see a kind of retreat in Asia in terms of its engagement. Pax Americana perhaps is not dead, but is at least giving way to China. The vacuum may be taken up by a more assertive China finding its way in the world. Should we be worried about this? And what should we make of that?
Well, I think first of all, it's true that TPP's demise, at least America's decision to pull out of TPP, has created a vacuum that the Chinese can happily fill with things like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. You've also got the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, you've got the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a whole bunch of things which are kind of Chinese-led 21st century institutions to, in one sense, rival the 20th century institutions created by the US, like, for example, the IMF or the World Bank, and so on and so forth. And I certainly think that this creates the possibility of a rival version of globalization. In other words, we used to think there was only one globalization with one country at the helm, which is basically the US. Everyone else kind of followed suit. Now we have a Chinese version which is competing with the US version. It may be that they can compete in a cooperative fashion, perhaps, but at the same time there's obviously the danger of some sort of emerging superpower rivalry that comes through in the years ahead. And you can look back in history and realize that when you've got an ascendant power and an existing power going head to head, then life can become quite tricky.
Yeah. And China, of course, has its own agenda in terms of supporting the Belt and Road Initiative, which could be a great boon for ASEAN as well.
Yes, it could be. I mean, if you look at the sort of great undiscovered parts of the global economic system, whereby there are the possibility of creating new trade routes, new supply routes, new routes for capital to flow down, then Belt and Road is one of those obvious stories. It's worth stressing that trade across parts of Asia is still very thin. For example, between China and India it's very thin. Trade between Asia and Africa and Latin America is still very thin. So those kind of southern Silk Roads could be recreated in the years ahead, but it does give a big initiative to Asia to grow a lot faster. And in fact, this is in one sense a return to the past, because if you go back, let's say 1,000 years or so, and think about how the world used to be, of course it was centered very much on Asia, Eurasia, connections across the Indian Ocean, all entirely familiar. And it's only really with the advent of Christopher Columbus and his sailing across the Atlantic to discover the Americas that you end up with a sudden shift in economic power to the West. And my feeling is that we're seeing almost the reversal of that story now, that Columbus has been sunk and we're seeing the return of a more Asia-centric global story.
And finally, the Asia century.
The Asia century for 21st century, I think it's a potentially compelling story, yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much for spending the time. We've had a good day today, fascinating. Have a good trip back to the UK, which here at the moment is hotter than Singapore, believe it or not.
It is truly remarkable. I think probably less humid, but I think it's certainly been hotter over the last few days, yeah.
Great to see you. Look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.